Hi, everybody. Joanna Reeds here. I'm here with my good friend David from Four Corners of the Page. I'm so excited to talk with David today because we've been having a discussion about book difficulty and trying to assess whether it's the book that's difficult or whether it's the reader that has the challenge and how we talk about that term in general. And this whole conversation came about because David and I are Malazan fans, and I feel like one of the most prevalent discussions that gets brought up all the time when it comes to Malazan is whether it's difficult or confusing and this intimidation factor that comes up for people who are interested in the series. And so I had a conversation with David before this because I feel like, I don't know, I just don't feel like there's a lot of nuance when I hear people say either it's difficult or it's
Mm.
not difficult and it's overblown. And so I feel like there's a lot to be said about what is it that makes a book difficult and how that can vary depending on the reader, their experience, and then different aspects of ways, yeah, that books can be difficult. So, David, welcome to my channel. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. What Joanna's not telling you, everybody, is that we spent about 45 minutes trying to make my 1 bar of data work. And so this is the best solution we've come up with. So, Joanna, if I talk over you, it's not on purpose. It might be due to social incompetence, but it's probably due to the lag issue. But it's really nice to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you, and you're totally worth the 40-minute wait to try to get this settled. So, David, I guess there are a few different ways we can start this discussion.
Hmm.
I do want to get into Malazan at some point and talk about the Malazan difficulty question, but
Hmm.
we're going to talk about other books too, other books
Yep.
that are talked about on BookTube as being difficult. But I guess maybe the first question I have for you, and just to start things going, is what do you think of what's the first thing that comes to your mind when somebody says, "Ooh, that book is difficult"?
That's a good question. Um, I think I'd rewind it a bit further because when we kind of talked about this topic kind of off air, one thing that I began to realize was that if you take a step back and you kind of think about different modes of text and art and creativity, when we say a book is difficult, we do automatically carry a set of assumptions behind that, most of them negative. There's sometimes a gatekeeping element and things like that, or we associate certain book series like Malazan with difficulty. But if you say to someone, this painting is difficult, or this piece of music is difficult, that can mean a million different things. So we seem to intrinsically understand, don't we, that difficulty is actually very nebulous and vague and dependent upon the text. When it's other types of text, but something about fiction, we tend to automatically assume we all know what we're talking about, don't we?
Mhm. Yeah, that's exactly why I wanted to have this discussion because I
Yeah.
feel like people might be talking about different things when they're referring to that word. And so maybe let's get into what the different ways that a book can be difficult. And I thought we would also go ahead and bring up examples as well if we
Yep.
have any.
Mhm.
If not, we can talk about maybe examples that we imagine might be difficult in that regard. How do you feel about
Yep.
that?
That's fine. I've got a story for you first, if you don't mind.
No, please go ahead.
So I want to tell you about the first book that I read for my undergraduate degree for university. So I was this was like about 14 years ago, and I just started my English literature course. And the lecturer has like 250, 300 English undergrads in the room. And she goes, okay, I'm going to assign you your first text, which is a book called The Land of Green Plums by an author called, I believe her name was Herta Müller. I don't know if you know her.
Mm-mm.
So she assigned us this text. I said was. I have no idea if Herta Müller is still with us or not. But
Mm.
basically I bought this text. It came really late on Amazon, so I had to read the whole thing in a day. And this thing won a Nobel Prize. But for me, it was genuinely the worst thing I've ever read in my life. I hated it, and I stuck with it. Gritted my teeth and read this 300-page, 200-page novel. But I found it just completely impossible to follow, and for various different reasons. And so I was a bit fed up. And I came back into my lecture hall the next day, having read this book, and the lecturer said, "Right, hands up if you got your text of Land of Green Plums," and everyone put their hands up. And the lecturer said, "Hands up if you finished it," and like a few of us put our hands up. And she goes, "The reason that I assigned you Land of Green Plums is because it's the most difficult thing you'll ever read." Ever in your university career. No matter how far you get up the chain, this book is the book that you will remember as the most difficult book ever. So she's like, I wanted to get that out of the way. Um, And I kind of realized what she was doing, right? She was kind of trying to tell us, listen, everything is smooth sailing. If you can handle this, you can handle anything. But I kind of took umbrage with it. I kind of felt like it was a bit unfair to I guess give us that trial by fire at the beginning, because difficulty can put people off, and it can be something that switches people off to reading. So I often think about that when we're having, talks about difficulty and difficult text. That if you're talking about examples, for me, The Land of Green Plums is the ultimate example of that. And it is an example of something that can switch people off to reading in general.
Hmm. And so what was difficult about it? Do you remember?
Very little. So it was about Ceausescu's Romania. So I think part of the reason that it's difficult and fragmented and kind of all over the place is it's supposed to, in retrospect, I think it's supposed to mirror the social distress of that time, and the people going through this very confusing totalitarian regime. So I remember the plot was very splintered. The prose was actually very spare, but in a way that I found quite difficult to follow. The actual sequence of events, the plotting was kind of all over the place. Again, I think intentionally, but there were just so many things going on with it that I just didn't gel with it. I don't know if you have a similar experience with a book that you had to get through, or you did just get through for sheer through sheer force of will. That always kind of sticks out to you as the text that I guess encapsulates difficulty.
Um, so the memory that immediately comes to my mind is when I was in high school. I remember taking AP history, and my history teacher, it was US history. He was fantastic in that he assembled a textbook of his own that was a compilation of various excerpts of writing from various people throughout history whose ideas informed the larger idea of the United States and States of America. So he had writings from like Locke, Thoreau, Hobbes, George Washington, Reagan, all the way up until like even had like some excerpts from Mein Kampf and social like Karl Marx and
Yeah,
like all the way up until like I think I want to say up until Reagan maybe. And but I remember reading some of those earlier works in that, and my homework would be to read a chapter of these
yeah,
excerpts. And so I was just reading the direct writings, and I remember at that time, I struggled with that. Like, I remember I had
yeah.
to look up words all the time, and it just took me forever. It felt like it took, like, all afternoon for me to get through those excerpts and understand what the heck I was reading. But yeah, I do remember that being a challenge for me at the time. That's the first time that I felt like I had to really work, at understanding what I was reading.
Did you feel a sense of reward when you finished it, or did you feel sort of deflated and disappointed? Because I guess this is part of the issue, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, I think I felt a sense of reward, but it was mostly
Yeah.
because of that teacher, because he did such an amazing job with, presenting that material by giving you an overview at the beginning with some information about the writer and what was going on in the world, and afterwards, he would also write down bullet points and ask certain questions, key questions, write down
Hmm.
key terms,
Yes.
so he was able to bring it together and help you understand and extract the main points. And so it helped to actually read those direct writings for yourself, to grapple with the actual text itself, but then
Yeah.
to bring it into the context of what we were dealing with the larger framework of this is the philosophy of the United States, or these are the ideas that shaped the country that we know. I felt
Yeah.
like it was rewarding because we were bringing things into context. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But that scaffolding and that kind of that help from the teacher. That what was it? John from
Mhm.
Talking Stories said at the beginning of your Gene Wolfe discussion. The Sherpa on the mountain. That is a necessity sometimes, isn't it?
It is. Well,
Yeah.
okay, and that's gonna lead to another point that I wanted to ask about too, because this is gonna also lead into the discussion about whether, because I know some people, for example, ever since I mentioned that I was reading Book of the New Sun, there were several people who mentioned a certain podcast. I can't remember off the top of my head, though I'm sure people will say what it is in the comment section. And this is something that came up for me. I know when I was reading Malazan Book of the Fallen, I think
Mm.
it was in books 3 and 4. I listened a little bit to the 10 Very Big Books podcast. Are you familiar with that
Yeah.
podcast? Yeah.
Familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to it. They do a good breakdown of the various sections or the various books within each book,
Mm.
and they have a discussion about it. But as much as I thought it was kind of helpful. It definitely pointed out some things that I did miss here and there. I found I didn't really enjoy nothing against that podcast. They were great, great hosts, great podcast. But I found that I wanted to have my own experience with the text first. I wanted to
Hmm.
engage with it on my own, to come and arrive at my own insights and ideas and thematic explorations. And I found that made the experience very intimate for me. And then it
Yes.
also added a layer to, like, the discussions that I would have, on BookTube later on with other
Yeah.
friends. And yeah, so I feel like there's something to that, to having your own experience with this, and it leads me to ask you, because I know that you teach English literature, like,
Yeah.
because I know that this is something that I often hear from English teachers and from actually educators in general, is that students these days are just they want the ready-made answer, and they don't want to
Yes.
explore and find different ways of looking at things, and that's something that we're gonna talk about too, is there's not just one way to look at a book. There's not just one
Yes.
lens. And I know, like, with Malazan, the series that you and I adore, a lot of
Yeah.
times everybody talks about compassion, compassion, but there are several ways to look at that series outside of just the lens of compassion, even though it is certainly important.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I would agree. I think with teaching, I think what you said about the interpretation thing is so right. Like there's different kind of strata as you're trying to lead the kids up the mountain. I guess the first thing is making sure they have the tools to actually read the thing. But what you'll notice as well is that there's something called reading comprehension deficiency, right? Where you'll have kids who can stand up in class with the book, kind of old school style, and they can read the whole thing out. And it sounds as though they've understood it. It sounds as though they've got it. That the reading is the flowing, the emphasis is on the right words. It sounds perfect. And then you'll say to a child, okay, so just the very basic who, what, when, where, why questions, and they'll kind of look at you and go, and there's a puzzlement. So there's a thing with children as well, adults as well, I guess, where you have to try and find a way to identify to what extent are they actually getting what they're getting, or is there um, a misunderstanding here, and also are the children aware of that misunderstanding? There's so much kind of legwork to do before you even get into the sense of literary interpretation, which is where we want to get them at the end, that kind of critical analysis. And I guess part of it goes back to the earlier thing I said about Land of Green Plums, and also kind of what you said on with about Gene Wolfe as well, with Book of the New Sun, is that when you don't understand something, or when you um, are aware that you're having that experience and the first time it's going to be tricky, is that something that we should be embarrassed about? I mean, the answer seems to be obviously no, but there is sort of a thing, I don't know if it's culturally or just kind of in the reading sphere, where if you don't understand something, that almost does feel like a badge of shame sometimes. So one thing I really loved about that Gene Wolfe discussion was that you're all, I mean, what was it Preacher had on his tagline? What was it? Preacher doesn't understand anything, something like that. And I kind of
Something like
like
that.
that because there's like an emancipatory element to that of like, hey, I'm not getting this whole thing. I hope Preacher doesn't mind me using him as an example. But that's okay because it takes that first step to recognize that we're not going to get everything on a first pass. And there's other authors to talk about there. And that's okay. It's okay not to understand everything because you will have that second experience with friends, with people, with a podcast. But I think that layer of embarrassment, certainly in some cultures over others, is something that's really quite thorny and difficult to get
Ah.
through. Does that make sense?
I love that, yes, and I
Yeah,
think that that was a special discussion because it was very humbling. It was a little embarrassing,
yeah,
realizing, "Oh, wow, I didn't catch half the things that were in this book. I did
yeah,
not read this book as carefully as I thought I did." But knowing especially with a group like that, where everybody was just like, "Yeah, I feel the same way," just realizing you're
exactly.
not alone, it kind of felt like we were all on this huge roller coaster ride together, where it's like, "What?" Like, we're just I don't know, we're having this amazing revelation of not knowing, of realizing there's just so much that
Yeah,
I didn't catch and I maybe could have caught. Like, it maybe the book like, I understand there's this is one of those books where there is certainly more context from what I understand that will be revealed later on that will
mm,
bring certain clarity about for the first read, but I thought it was just fascinating to be exposed in that way. And I do agree, like, most of the time when people when they encounter that, it it's not, um it's not approached in a very comfortable way. Usually, I mean,
Yeah,
not that it's comfortable, but it's more so that it's so, like, something to be ashamed of to the point where they might be intimidated to pick up another book or to go further into a story.
yeah,
I've talked to friends who actually get mad if the book isn't clear enough.
yeah.
Yeah, and I also wonder about that too because I know, I can understand. My friend Brian from the channel Bookish talked about this
Mm,
particular complaint, and I totally understand his perspective, and I have to agree with him to some extent about this, which is that, um, it's not fun as a reader if you feel like you're reading a book where you have to have, like, a companion book in order to understand what the author was intending. If the author has to write, like, a supplemental companion book to explain their book now,
yes.
I'm not saying Gene Wolfe did that. I think that Gene Wolfe actually he actually did make certain everything that he wrote I think could be clarified with careful reading, and with
Hmm.
further reading. But I do question books that are so ambiguous that you can't understand unless you have a companion novel or you have the author
Yeah.
explaining things.
Finnegan's Wake is the really famous. I mean, James Joyce in general is the famous example, isn't it? Where that, I mean, I haven't read Finnegan's Wake, but my understanding, having glossed through it, is that it's basically incomprehensible unless you have someone next to you, basically telling you what's going on. But I guess this kind of leads back to what, like, the Gene Wolfe discussion I found was really interesting because I can't remember if you said it to me off air, if you said this, maybe both. But you said that for you, Gene Wolfe, the difficulty wasn't the prose. And for so many people, when difficulty equals complexity of the actual sentence constructions and things like that. But you, when we had that discussion, you kind of intimated to me it wasn't that at all, that the prose was fairly okay. It was all the paraphernalia around the prose that was the issue. Am I getting
Yes.
that right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what I said.
Yeah.
I don't think that it is difficult on the level of prose. That was my expectation. I was
Yeah.
thinking it would be very dense and thick, that the prose would be very thick to read through and to understand. I did not find that to be the issue. I His
Hmm.
prose is beautiful, gifted writer,
Mm.
gorgeous, stunning passages, very atmospheric, but at the same time, I didn't feel like it was unreadable. I've read books before where the prose was very thick. I can give you some examples here in a minute, but no, I didn't think it was difficult in that way, though there are some archaic terms. He does create his own terms, so there is that, but it's more, how it's hard to explain. There's a lot of symbolism, and
Yes.
there is there are things that happen and you understand, okay, this happened and that happened, but why did this happen?
Yeah.
What's the purpose of this happening? And that's where I think maybe in future books, further context is going to play a role. And
Yes.
additionally, I think I said this in my video, expectations versus reality video, my wrap up, that I think he also has a way of using certain terms that you're familiar with when you read sci-fi and fantasy, and you draw a
Hmm.
picture in your mind of what that is. But then if you read more carefully, you realize he's describing this in a very unusual and different way. He's kind
Yeah.
of playing with your preconceived ideas of what this actually is.
That's really clever. The thing that's kind of coming to mind as well is when we're talking about difficulty and prose. It seems like we're kind of talking about prose now. Um, I had a real struggle with a certain type of literature or culture of literature because I really tried. If you, I used to live in Japan, as you know, and I really tried hard to get into Japanese literature, like capital L literature. I bought like 4 or 5 books, and a lot of these classic Japanese literary texts are not long. Right? They're like 250, 300 pages long. You look at them and you think, man, I'll get through this in an afternoon and be cleverer by the end of the day. Um, and I bounced off so many of these texts, which actually have, at least in the translation, very simple, very spare prose. And it took me a while to, and I have friends who love these books to death. And it took me a while to work out why I wasn't gelling with them because I felt like I understood the plot generally. But what was happening with my experience of reading those books? So I read Black Rain, which is a fictional account of, but basically semi autobiographical of Hiroshima. I read, it's called Snow Country by, and I'm blanking on the name, Temple of the Golden Pavilion, lots of these classic Japanese texts. And I struggled. And it was because there was so much subtext on the page. And maybe it's because I was a younger reader, but often what I was finding is that characters would be having these interactions on the page. And I'd kind of be nodding along, going, yes, they're talking about whatever, the weather. And then suddenly, 2 pages later, the author's treating things like something monumental and humongous has altered the shape of their destinies forever. And I'm kind of scrabbling back and forth in the pages, like, what did is there a chapter missing? Do you know what I mean? But the reality is I was not sophisticated enough at the time, or maybe it was a cultural difference, or, there's different interpretations there. But I was not adept enough to be able to get detail out of those books by myself because there was so much layer underneath the simple prose. And it kind of goes back to what you're saying about Wolfe, is that the simple prose can sometimes actually belie a huge amount of depth that we can glaze over if we're not armed and ready for it.
Yes. No, I
Yeah,
completely agree with you. I certainly think that the subtext factor can play a
yeah,
role, in affecting somebody's experience or understanding of
yeah,
a text. Absolutely. That's a good example too. That's really
yeah.
interesting.
I mean,
Yeah.
Japanese culture is kind of rooted in this subtext. I said the thing I say to people is like, if you tell someone in Scotland to open a window, they'll open the window or they'll say no. But my experience, and again, not Japanese, but my experience living in Japan was, if you tell someone to open a window or ask someone to open a window, that the subtext could be interpreted 6 or 7 different ways, depending on various contextual factors.
Oh,
Um, but I
that's
think it's a
interesting.
various, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very a problem that is obviously worldwide and depends on the author you're reading. I think Erikson does this a lot, actually. Um,
Yes.
if we go to Malazan for a second, I'm sure we'll bounce off Malazan here and there, but often
Yeah.
in Malazan, one thing that I notice is in dialogue, the characters often have like physical reactions. I don't know if you've picked
Mm.
up on this. I'm sure you
Yes.
have. When
Mhm.
when when dialogue is uttered, characters are often visibly stumble or look as if they've been slapped, or there's some kind of physical reaction to the dialogue on the page. And I, as a reader, found that very helpful on a first pass, because even when I wasn't understanding what was going on at all, I was able to sort of approximate the weight of the words based on that physical reaction. Um,
You're
but yeah,
immediately making me think
yeah,
of a certain passage in, Midnight Tides that I read, like, 10 times in a row because there was what was said, and then there was what was described with what the characters were
yes,
doing, and it made me,
yes,
like, reanalyze what is going on, what are they actually thinking, how are they
yes.
interpreting this? Like, it was actually incredible. I actually loved that experience, but
Can
I
you
guess
can
I
you
kind of
refer to it what it was obliquely? I'm curious which one it was.
oh,
Is there any way you
I'll
can
tell you
sort of?
later. I'll tell you
Okay,
later. Yeah.
yeah. Bone Hunters also has that as well. Again, no spoilers, but towards the end of the Bone Hunters, there's a scene that's very much like that.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
that's so cool. So I think that's really cool though when an author can
yeah,
do that, especially if they
yeah.
could talk about that through body language and everything. And you were
Uh-huh.
talking about that in Japan. I remember when I went to Japan, my husband, he studies the Japanese language and their culture quite a
Mm,
bit, and he was telling me, he said, "You have to understand that saying, no or you have to understand certain things like that, that it doesn't they have a hard time saying no." I think that's what he told me,
yeah,
something along those lines, like if you're at a restaurant or something like that, I don't know.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it was interesting. We did kind of run into a couple little things like that that were interesting, but yeah, I think the subtext factor is one of them for sure. I think there are other ways that prose can be somewhat challenging too. So, another example that comes to mind since that we both read, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy.
I have Cormac McCarthy written down right here. Ah, yep,
You?
yep. Uh-huh.
I have
Yeah.
my version right here.
Oh, he was number 2 on my list of books that I jotted down this afternoon. Yeah.
Yes, I have a whole stack here too.
Me too. They're on my floor, but yeah.
Yeah. So what did you think made McCarthy's prose challenging? And it's interesting, by the way, because I know you've read a lot more McCarthy than I have, but he
Yeah.
tends to have he has a couple of different ways that he varies his
Yes.
techniques as a writer. And if
Yeah.
you read like No Country for Old Men, for example, which is the first McCarthy book I read, you might
Yeah.
think that his prose is not difficult to read, but
Yeah.
then you read Blood Meridian and it's a whole other ballgame.
Suttree as well. Yeah.
Ah, yeah.
Have you read Suttree?
I have
Suttree, I don't know how you
not.
pronounce it. It's
I have
gorgeous. It's brilliant, but it's
oh,
like Blood Meridian in not in content but in style. Absolutely. What did you think of Blood
yes.
Meridian?
I think I mentioned this to you off air before. I
Yeah.
loved Blood Meridian, but I think what helped me through that experience is that
Hmm.
I buddy read it with my friend Jimmy. It was a reread for him. He invited me to. And we
Hmm.
agreed to it was the first book we ever buddy read together, and we agreed to read only about 10 to 15 pages a day.
Yeah.
And that was so helpful for my first time reading Blood Meridian because
Hmm.
there's a lot to unpack and to talk about with just 10 pages of the book.
Hmm.
So I had a good experience because I did pace myself. I think if I had tried to just read through it, you know what I mean? Like, just
Yeah.
try to blaze through it, I don't think I would have had as positive an experience, but I think pacing myself in that way and then talking about it with a friend, especially one as insightful as Jimmy, was really
Yeah.
helpful. But also, I personally connected to it because I'm from the Southwest region of the United States. I have family in northern Mexico, so I'm very familiar with the regions that McCarthy explores,
Yeah.
and, I have a personal because of that, I have a personal connection to the desert, and, I
Yeah.
mean, while the book is extremely, unsettling and graphic and depicts violence, in such a visceral way, it also describes the desert in an almost, um, I don't know, psychedelic way. It's so beautiful the way he describes the desert and the way that
Hmm.
he varies the imagery because it's a traveling narrative,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I think a less refined author might just describe the desert as just like sandhills and maybe some tumbleweeds here and there.
Yeah.
McCarthy, he has this rich and beautiful visual way of describing the desert, colorful way of describing the desert with so much variation throughout the story. So for me, that was absolutely mesmerizing. And at the same time, it was an interesting book because it does have some thick passages. It does have some, like, when we're talking about density of prose, it does have, I don't know, like page long paragraphs that feel like run on sentences.
Yeah.
And yet it still has this propulsive feeling of moving forward, this forward momentum of they wrote on, this repetition that happens.
Yeah.
They wrote on, and it has this rhythm to it, but it felt very poetic for me. It felt like reading poetry in a way.
Yes. Yes. Poetry is the way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I told you about when I first read Blood Meridian, right? I was on a plane. I told you
Go
about
ahead,
this,
repeat
right?
the story.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I was flying. I was living in the US at the time. I was doing an exchange student program, and so I was flying from Glasgow to I think it was New York City or Boston or somewhere, but like a 5, 6, 7 hour plane journey. And I just recently read an article of Stephen King's favorite books, and I think that's where it came from.
Oh.
And yeah, so there was Lonesome Dove and there was Blood Meridian and there was a few others. And I thought, you know what, I'll Blood Meridian, Amazon, £1, go, it's here, good. But I had no idea what it was about. But so everyone hates that Blood Meridian cover. You know the one I'm talking about, the kind of smoky red, big bold font. Do you know the one I'm
Is this
talking
the
about?
one or is it a different one?
No, no, it's a different one. It's a different one.
I
And
love this
this
cover.
that's yeah, and Suttree, the cover for Suttree is very equivalent to that
Mm.
and gorgeous. But everyone hates this one. But it looks like it's going to be a lot more light based on that cover. It looks like it's just going to be sort of a thriller western sort of thing. I had no idea what it was. So I sat down on this plane as it was taking off and I turned the page, in the chapter one, and you immediately get hit with that old timey what do you call them? The chapter openings where it basically tells you what's going to happen in each chapter.
Like the
Um,
epigraph.
yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah,
sort
yeah,
of like
yeah.
epigraphs, but they're almost like outlines of what's gonna happen in the
Yeah, yeah,
chapter.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so this comes, and then like, see the child, and you get
Mhm.
immediately into it, and immediately like his mother's died or his father's run. I forget how the book starts. But
Right. No,
immediately,
that's yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Immediately I'm like, oh, this is not what I thought it was. And so I read the first like 200 pages on a 7 hour plane, and I'm not a fast or slow reader. I'm sort of in the middle, but 7 hours, 200 pages is quite slow going, I would say, or medium to slow going. Um, and I'll be honest at that stage in my life, because I think I was about 19 and I was an idiotic 19-year-old, I probably would have
Same.
bounced off that book had I not had that. It was kind of the opposite to yourself. If I was not basically in prison for 7 hours, I probably would never have read Blood Meridian. But I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that I got basically locked in a room in economy because I like it's once you can get through what this book is. It's interesting. There's a book. Is it Matt's Fantasy Book Review? Someone gave this book a 1 star, Blood Meridian, and I find that review really interesting because I forget who it was. I'll find it later. This person articulated the book perfectly and still gave it a 1 star. And I kind of get that because the book, it feels like at the beginning, is trying to shove you off. It's trying to buck you off because you've got really dense poetic prose, as you said, like this kind of purple poetic perfumey prose. It's got old historical context that it doesn't really clue you in on. It just expects you to either understand what's going on or not. Huge amounts of historical context, huge amounts of
Mhm.
subtext. The characters, you could argue, are quite thin. I mean, you could dispute that. I mean, the judge is certainly not thin, but like I would say the kid is purposely thin. So it's doing everything wrong, basically. And yet it was this enrapturing, wonderful, can you call it wonderful? Brilliant novel that I'm so glad that I had to basically stick with and understand. Again, going back to what we said earlier, that sense of reward that comes with a text and that sort of one-on-one approach to a book. So I
Yeah.
love McCarthy, and I probably wouldn't have if I hadn't had that first sort of "you're going to stick with this because there's nothing else to do" sort of
That
experience.
is so funny. I love
Yeah,
that. You're like, "I had to be locked in to read this
yeah.
book." I'm so grateful.
We need to be
That's
locked in with more books, I think.
That's great. No, I love it. I think and I really do think this is an excellent example of
Yeah.
brilliant but challenging prose,
Mm.
challenging on many levels. But yes, I was taken with it. I do want to reread it someday. But yes, there's a lot to say about it for sure. And the characters are a little on the flat side, I would say.
Yeah.
I find that's sometimes the case for these kind of books. Um,
Yeah. Have you read any other McCarthy?
I have, yeah. So my favorite is All the Pretty Horses.
Oh, I
I
love the
just
Border trilogy. Yeah.
I have not finished the last book yet because I've been buddy reading that also with Jimmy, but we read, All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing together. I
Yeah.
mentioned No Country for Old Men,
Hmm.
and then Blood Meridian, but yeah, I think oh, and Sunset Limited. I read that
Oh,
book
that's right.
again.
We talked about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a bleak little play, isn't it? The Sunset
It
Limited.
is.
Yeah,
I think it's, like, one of the strongest portrayals of nihilism I've ever read.
yeah, yeah,
One of the
yeah,
strongest.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Have you read his
so
first book? Sorry
what
to
is it?
interrupt you. I'm sitting here
Go
on the
ahead.
surface of the moon with a one bar. Um, I'm trying to remember The Orchard Keeper. His first book
I
called The
haven't
Orchard Keeper.
I
It's
haven't read any of his
rubbish.
other books. Mm-mm.
It's really bad. It's a really bad book because, and I'm sure someone will disagree with me on this, but I feel like The Orchard Keeper is McCarthy not trying to do Blood Meridian because stylistically it's much more like No Country for Old Men. But that book failed for me in a way that all of McCarthy's later books don't. And you could maybe argue The Passenger and Stella Maris are somewhere in the middle, but I feel like McCarthy's first outing, personally for me, he was trying to do all these things, right? He was trying to be a little bit cryptic and subtextual. He wasn't feeding you all the information, and there's lots of inference that he tries to lead you through. But for me, that first book just doesn't make sense. It doesn't cohere. So it shows how, first of all, an author has to build up this skill, I guess, but also just the fact that it takes a huge master to be able to pull off some of these things and so many things juggled at once. That it's not just this natural capability. It takes decades of practice to produce something like Blood Meridian. Because the Orchard Keeper's
Mm.
garbage, man. It's awful. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Back to a fantasy example, I just wanted to bring it up because I know it gets brought up a lot in the context of prose that's difficult, or purple or flowery, though people will argue about this all the time, and that's gonna
Yeah.
be Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Wurts. Now, I know you haven't read Janny Wurts yet, but, I personally really I think she's a very gifted writer. The thing though that is going to be the most divisive and the only thing I think is really difficult about this series, not to say it doesn't have layers and, interesting ideas that are
Mm,
developed in a rich way, but I don't think it's difficult to follow the story. I find though that this is gonna be most divisive because of the prose specifically. And it's again, it's one of those things that has to do with, more with style than I would say anything else. But
yeah.
one thing that Words does that I think is gonna be a little off-putting for for some readers is that she does write not only very descriptive, rich sentences, but she has this pattern or this rhythmic pattern in her writing that a lot of people love. Like, for example, I've read passages aloud to my mother, and my mother is a big prose snob, and she doesn't really read a lot of fantasy, but she's very well read in classic literature, and
Yes.
she just gushes every time I read aloud a Jenny Wurts passage. Like, my mom thinks that Jenny Wurts is one of the best writers that she's come across in recent times. She thinks that the woman paints with her words
Yeah.
and has lilting and rich and musical descriptions. But something else about Jenny's prose is that and what adds that layer of complexity, I would say,
Hmm.
is that she writes very long introductory phrases. Do you know what I mean by introductory phrases?
Explain it. Explain it to me. I
I
think I know
okay,
what you mean, but I wanted to double check.
I might be using the wrong terminology when I say that, so if you're an English literature teacher, so you can correct me if this is the wrong way to put it.
I'm also a moron, so
Ah, no, you're not. But here's
one.
a couple of examples of what I mean.
Yeah.
So, relaxed in rare book fell, sorry. Relaxed in rare contentment, too recently delivered from centuries of sunless damp to take in the hail spring of earth for granted, he let his spirit soar with the winds.
Okay, so this the subject of the sentence is coming way late.
That's what I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. It's active voice when you get there.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
active voice because it says he let his spirit soar, but it takes a long time before you get to the subject of the phrase and the subject and the
Yeah. Yeah.
verb. It's this long description. So it's like, okay, what are we talking about for
Yeah.
like this long passage of time? Here's another example, and there are so many examples.
Okay.
Untroubled by the after presence of Paravium spirits, not at all disturbed by the foundations of ancient ruins that underlay the hammocks of wild roses, the sorcerer rode with his reins looped. And it's like when we get to that part of the sentence, it's short, but everything leading up to it is so long. So
Yeah.
yeah. So usually, like, when I'm reading her, books, at least at first, it took some adjustment because I would be like, "Okay, what are we talking about for this whole long part of the sentence?" And then I
Yeah.
get there like, "Oh," and then I have to go back, "Okay, put that together with that." So it can kinda just take a little bit of, concentration
Yeah. And
for
this
slowing
also
down.
happens with scene transitions, right? Where an author moves to a new scene and they spend about 3 paragraphs describing everything but what the character is doing. And so it almost feels like there's a void in your reading experience because you can't visualize the central thing. You're just kind of almost viewing the paraphernalia around it, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's what
Yeah.
that's what I think stylistically that's one of the things that she does stylistically that I think will force you to slow down and have to try to understand what's going on.
Yep.
I find with Wurtz's prose, the strange thing is that when it works the best for me is when I don't think too hard about it.
Yes.
If I
Yeah.
just, like, go into the visual center of my mind and I just try to let the images show up as the
Yeah.
words or as I see the words, and try not to think too hard about what she's trying to say, then it kind of makes sense. But if I try to understand it analytically, I get stuck.
Have you
So it's
tried
a
the
really
audiobook experience?
there are no audiobooks for this series except for the first book, and it wasn't out when I read it.
Do you know? I think it's one of these, and you could correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems as though Janny Wurts has a huge presence on BookTube, and everyone who's read her on BookTube loves her. But maybe
Not everyone, but I
not.
mean, not everyone
Oh
loves
yeah,
her
yeah.
style, but yeah, a lot of people in
But
our
maybe
corner
maybe
do.
she's more present in our corner of the internet than maybe she is, than
Yeah,
I'm led to believe. Yeah.
yeah.
Because
No, she's
the reason I ask is that it sounds fantastic when you read it out, and it seems like audiobook might be the way to go there.
I agree. I
Yeah.
think and she said so herself. She feels like her books would be best served by audiobook
Hmm.
recordings, but sadly, her publishers never got around to doing that. She's with Harper Press or
Yeah.
Harper Prism, but I mean, it's gorgeous prose. It's really
Yeah.
gorgeous. Like there are some phrases that I find so stunning in her work. But I do know that they are very popular in our corner for sure. I know
Yeah.
some people though on BookTube have reached out to me and said, "I'm sorry, but that's just too flowery for me." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"I get it. I understand."
Well,
um,
the similar example here, I guess, is Carcanis. I don't think you've read Carcanis, right, by
Not yet.
Erikson, but
No, I've heard great
very,
things
very
though.
similar. And he said in interviews, right, that he deliberately designed this trilogy as is going to be this almost, I think, spoken breaths is what he's used to articulate that it's not supposed to be read on the page. It's kind of supposed to be read out loud as an audio experience, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
is interesting, and I know Janny Wurts has said herself too that she is written with the intention that you slow down as a reader because she thinks the best experiences in life happen when we as readers or we as people take the time to slow down. And that's something that I think is a beautiful sentiment, but I can also
Hmm.
understand if somebody's reading and they are struggling with trying to slow down. Like their mind wants to speed up, but they need to slow down. And I
Yes.
find it really interesting. This relates to that pacing discussion I told you about that I had a couple years ago here on my channel. I
Hmm.
didn't
Yeah.
realize until at one point, I guess, when I saw a Steven Erikson interview, the authors actually use specific techniques in order to make the pacing feel like it's going faster or feel like it's going
Yes.
slower, and I think that's really interesting.
Do you know, just going back to the thing on BookTube as well, I often wonder with like because I'm thinking about Janny Wurts, right? And I'm thinking about the fact that we're supposed to slow and take it kind of in a considered approach in Erikson too, and kind of and almost like kind of enjoy and relish a slightly kind of slower kind of pace. And
Yes.
I sometimes wonder, and I won't refer this to other people, I'll refer this to myself. Do I sometimes ignore books because they're big and I think it will can take more of my time to get through it? And is there a sense in which that I'm kind of avoiding books that are going to consume more cognitive load and take more of my time? Because I don't know, because I want to maybe just get through more of my TBR, or because I'm aware that I want to read X number of books this month, although I try not to do that. I wonder if there's an extent to which that we kind of ignore some of these larger texts for that reason. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, yeah. I know I do to some extent, especially because
Yeah,
I'm a slow reader, so it
yeah,
takes up a lot of time, and I know that as I've been reading the Word series, which I've enjoyed,
yeah,
I found that I've slowed down on how much epic fantasy I read because, 1, epic fantasy tends to be long, but
yep,
also
yeah,
it's just this need to have a different kind of style or a different type of genre. Like, my
hmm,
brain needs that, for some
hmm,
reason. But I do agree that it can be a lot of cognitive load if you're considering, "I'm gonna be reading a very long book," and
yeah,
having to consider all because it's long, I'm going to have to consider a lot of factors to make this whole entire experience, um, I don't know, just to make it what it is, to make it as monumental as it is, I have to look
yes,
at so many varying parts of that book.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah. And so that leads to another aspect, which is, and I think we could go further with the prose part too. I'll just quickly say too that another book I found challenging prose wise that I read recently is
hmm,
this book. I don't know. Have you ever heard of Clarice Lispector?
no,
Beautiful, stunning prose, but
hmm,
it is very stream of consciousness. And I
okay,
know for
yeah,
me, I have a struggle sometimes with stream of consciousness. Like, that is also a style that forces me to have to slow down or
hmm,
forces me to have to think a little bit, I don't know, think a little bit harder. And this book is actually an existentialist crisis. It's a woman who has an existentialist crisis because she watches a cockroach die. It's a really
okay,
interesting story. Yeah,
yeah,
that's the whole entire story, but yeah, it has a lot of layers to it. I think that stream of consciousness writing can also be another difficulty barrier, I think, when it comes to
yeah.
prose. Yeah.
Another one we talked about before we went live was Robin Hobb for the opposite reason, where people I think often can view Robin Hobb as a little bit it's not simple, but I don't think Robin Hobb gets the reputation she deserves. I mean, difficult maybe is the wrong word because difficult is loaded with a bunch of negative connotations, isn't it? But maybe that word rewarding is a little bit better with Hobb because you can read all of Robin Hobb. Well, I've read 9 of her books so far, so maybe I'm from book 10 it becomes impenetrably difficult, but certainly books 1 through 9 I do not find difficult to read at all, and I know you agreed with me and said the same. Story wise, you can just breeze through them. And if you don't take that time to reflect and slow down, you're missing so much. You're missing all that thematic complexity. You're missing all that character complexity. And often, when it goes the other way, that the prose is very simple and very light, you're actually failing to recognize, and maybe this goes back to Gene Wolfe as well, just how much can be, excuse me, going on under the surface. I think
Yes.
Hobbes probably the premier example of that.
I love that. I mean, I just
Yeah,
recently read Ship of Magic, and,
of
I
course.
think I
Yeah.
was telling you about this beforehand, like, I found it was so consumable. I could easily read that book for hours and hours a day, and I did.
Hmm.
It would take me a long time to get through that length of a book, and I do not listen to the audiobooks with Robin Hobb. I just at least not for
Yeah.
Farseer and Liveship, the audiobook narrators are just atrocious. So I
Really.
did visually read it, which takes me even longer if I'm just visually reading, but I found I could easily just visually read her books for hours and hours and hours without ever
Hmm.
feeling tired at all, and at the
Yes.
same time, it has this illusion of being easy, I guess, because it is consumable, it is readable, she does have a clear and beautiful flow to her writing, but
Yes.
and she but she also gets you wrapped up in the drama of what's happening, in the drama of these characters, and so you're
Yeah.
playing out the picture of what's happening before you, But then if you stop and you take a step back and you consider what she's doing in a larger way, you realize, "Oh, wow. She's doing so much subtle character work." Not only that, but she's also doing so much, like, subtle thematic work throughout the
Yes.
series as a whole, and she's
Yes.
also doing loads of subtle world building that, she's just a master of show don't tell, because it's
Yes.
always presented just effortlessly through the different characters in the story without large info dumps.
Yeah. And you know what? With live ships, like when you finish all, I have a slight quibble with book three, but we'll avoid that for now. But one thing you can say is that when you finish all three, it becomes like a spider's web, a tapestry. Like the amount of interconnections that happen between scenes, that even characters who really have nothing to do with each other, the thematic complexity just becomes this great big weave. But again, goes back to that word masterful. I'm being quite careful with Hobb because I can't remember what happens in Ship of Magic versus Ship of Destiny, and I'm terrified of spoiling something. But I
Don't
think
spoil it.
yeah, no, 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 don't worry. But she is I think, the absolute example of, I think, people like, not taking her seriously is the wrong way of putting it, because she's beloved and she's recognized for her talent. But at the same time, maybe the idea that we can skip through her books and ignore all of that, and we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that again, that difficulty. I think it is important.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think some authors are just really good at that in the sense that you can read their books in just an entertainment factor and
Yeah.
not notice all of the subtle work that they do.
Hmm.
I think that George R. R. Martin is another example of this. I don't know if you would
Yeah.
agree
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
me or not, but I mean, I reread A Song of Ice and Fire, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, and I was blown away because even though his prose is very easy to read, it's very consumable. He
Hmm.
does a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to
Yeah.
the various characters, their struggles with identity, uh, also just like the immersive settings and the subtext again. I've done a couple of close reading chapters with my friend Jimmy on his A Song of Ice and Fire podcast, and I was amazed how many little subtle things he was doing on the page that you might take for granted, that other authors were like, "Oh, I could do that." I'm like, "No, you can't."
Yeah.
He really knows what he's doing. He really,
Yes.
really knows what he's doing. I know a lot of people will disagree with me. I've had some people say, "Oh, he's not that good of a writer," but no, I personally think he's an excellent writer.
Yeah. I mean, it's why his books take so long, isn't it? You have to do that page by page times 1,000. The other thing that's just sparking off in my mind here is, often I don't know how much kind of ancient like stuff you've read, like Gilgamesh and all those kind of old narratives. They're very rarely difficult to understand. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight,
Mm,
would be
mhm.
another example. All these texts are the plot is very easy to follow. I read
Mhm.
Gilgamesh on a plane as well. I just remembered I was actually flying back the other way and I read Gilgamesh. And it's very, very easy to get. That plot, you'd think when you're reading something that's so just ancient, there would be some kind of disconnect, and it would be impossible to follow without guidance. But actually, some of these ancient stories that have stood the test of time are very similar to what we're talking about with Hobb and with Martin, where you can read it and you can then pick it apart later. But the actual enjoyment of the story does not is not dependent upon you getting all those links and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting that
Yes.
those are considered difficult, and
Yes.
maybe they're just considered difficult because the characters are not, modern characters? I'm not sure. Do you think it's the relatability factor? What would you attribute to the difficulty
It could
perception
also be
of
translation. Like someone could be having a very, very nice, gentle, cozy translation with the ones I've been reading. But I wonder if it's the opposite. Beowulf. Beowulf is another example.
Mm,
These stories, maybe they've stood the test of time because they're recognizable for maybe not a general audience, but people who enjoy the story are going to have no issue with them. Maybe if they were a bit more complex, those are the ones that sort of fall into obscurity. Maybe they need to be to some extent simple to become timeless. That sounded
hmm.
very smart. That sounded very smart,
That
didn't it? I'm gonna put that on a t-shirt.
That's an interesting theory. Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting. We
yeah.
also talked, I think, beforehand about structure, how the structure of
Mm,
a book can make a book
yes.
seem difficult, at least to some readers. Have you come across that? What book comes to mind when you think about the structure posing a challenge? And if you wanna think about that for a minute, I have an example here
Yeah, you
of
you go
one
first.
that yeah, so I guess I was kind of fortunate because I saw my friend Matt's review of this book before I picked it up, but Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny is a book that, I guess I could just read the back to give you a sense of what it's about. Earth is long
Mhm.
dead. We're kind of like in a futuristic timeline on a colony planet. Abandoned men have gained control of technology, making themselves immortal, and now they rule the world as gods of the Hindu pantheon. Yeah, it's like people posing to be gods. It's a interesting story. It's
Yeah.
very weird. I had a wonderful discussion here on my channel for this book as well. But I think one of the challenges of this book is that the structure is such that the prologue. I just remember that the prologue or chapter one happens at a later time, and then it goes back in time after that, and it
Mhm.
there's hardly a hint that that's the case. I guess somebody said there is a hint indication that's shown to
Yes.
you if you look carefully for it, but I would have missed it. I totally would have missed it had I not saw a friend's review, and I would have been so lost in this story if that hadn't been pointed out to me. And I think it does do some weird things with the timeline here and there throughout the story too.
Yeah.
So that's one that comes to my mind. Zelazny is a gifted writer, though. I was
Mhm.
so impressed with his prose. But
I
that's
think I
definitely one
think
that comes to mind.
structurally prologues are something that can either make a book or throw so many people off them.
Ah,
In particular. And it doesn't have to be that there's a time jump or anything like that. It could be, that the prologue could be the same cast of characters that we get in chapter one, but if the prologue is disorientating, that can be a huge issue. And I'm thinking of R. Scott Baker right now as well. I think
ah,
I've told you that the first 50 pages of The Darkness That Comes Before, I think I read that thing 3 times and just went, nope, and just put it to one side. And you read the next whatever, Dresden or whatever. And it's because I found that prologue so impenetrable, and I felt again. I think I said this about a previous text that it tried to. I felt like it was trying to throw me off. Um, this isn't really a structural concern. Well, I guess it is because beginning is structure, but how an author chooses to open their text can be
mm,
very telling about what they're trying to accomplish. But also, it can very much decide upon whether a reader is going to continue. And I would have read Baker about 4 or 5 years ago had I started with chapter one as opposed to that prologue. But what that prologue is
really?
doing is masterful. Yeah, the prologue's brilliant. Like now that I understand what's going on, it's
Yeah.
great. But you've got basically 7 pages of hardcore dense philosophy disguised as plot um, in the first
Mm,
prologue of two. So that was
yeah.
quite difficult. Going outside sci-fi fantasy, there's a lot of I quite like experimental literature and things like that, and I find
Mm,
there's a lot of authors that play with structure when they're doing kind of experimental text, and I find it can go two ways, right? So you've got either texts that deliberately play with structure and sort of textual data on the page, to sort of make the text more rich. So I'd say House of Leaves is a very controversial example, but I personally really like House of Leaves. I think it handles that kind of intertwining of structure and plot very well. But there's other texts that basically it just feels like a gimmick to make things a bit more difficult for difficulty's sake. So,
mm.
oh my goodness, there's a book called Bats of the New Republic, the Old Republic, or is that Star Wars? Bats of the Republic, by Zachary somebody. Yeah, I don't have the copy. Just Google it. That I would say plays with structure in a way that just feels surface level and makes things not so interesting. It just seems to add a layer of kind of obfuscation for obfuscation's sake. Um, there's other examples. So there's a very famous book called Gadsby. I don't know if you're aware that the one that was written without use of the letter E.
No, I don't know of it.
So this guy, I forget his name, basically just wrote a whole novel without using the letter E as a challenge to himself. And it's a game, right? So it does again what it's trying to do, absolutely. But what it does do is create a very boring novel that doesn't have the letter E in it. So I was like, some of these books I often read while traveling. I'll be on a train or something, and there's nothing else to do. So I read Gatsby on a train, and it was about 120 pages. It felt like 600. But I think there's often an extent to which, especially with highly experimental works, that the challenge is artificial. It doesn't serve the plot. It's there to sort of create this interesting layer of kind of sophistication that is actually quite hollow. So that's kind of
Yes.
where my mind went when you were talking about structure. I think this isn't as big a problem in sci-fi and fantasy. I think generally authors are quite purposeful with how they structure texts because they're aware that they need to keep the reader under, especially when it's a set in another world. They need to keep the reader understanding what's going on the page because they have a higher burden there if it's set in a fantasy world. But
Yes.
outside of that and the other kind of stuff I tend to enjoy, I find that structure can make or break a book to
Yes.
a really high level, high extent.
Yes. I agree with
Yeah,
you. So
yeah.
I wanna ask you then, how did you feel about the prologues in Malazan and Bakker the Fallen? Because some of those I
Oh,
would say are quite dense.
yes. I think so I made a video on the prologue to Gardens of the Moon. I thought it was fantastic. I
Oh,
think it
that's a
sets up those
fantastic
themes.
prologue.
Yeah, I think that sets up the themes really well. And you know
Yeah.
what? Just thinking about the Malazan prologues right now, I think I remember them all. Um, I think often the problem with the prologue is the writer feels like, right, I need to write a prologue before we can start chapter one. But all of the Malazan prologues feel thematically purposeful. Toll the Hounds has a very thematic prologue. I don't think anything really happens in that prologue. It's dogs in the street or something, isn't it? Um, they all serve the underlying purpose of setting up those themes. So I didn't have so much difficulty with them. And the other issue I think is with prologues is that the writer uses them as an excuse to sort of just do a bit of world building before they actually get into the main story, which I think is a bit of a shortcut, and that winds me up. What
I
about
think
you?
you
How did you feel about the Malazan prologues?
I thought they were complex, especially, like,
Yeah.
the first one I think that threw me. I don't really oh, no, I do remember. I do remember the Dead House Gates one. That one's cool. Um, I
Yes.
c I felt like I struggled with the Memories of Ice prologue, and it's a very important prologue for the series.
Yes.
Um, I struggled with that one, though. That was a little
That one's
abstract for me.
the ancient stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, my favorite is the Midnight Tides prologue, probably. I love that
Mm,
prologue.
yes.
I found some of those prologues a little challenging. I know AP Canavan has done Critical Dragon has done a lot of, prologue analysis videos on his channel, uh, and it's really interesting. I know he highly encourages rereading the prologue after you finish the book to understand that
Mm.
context, and I've done that with books before, and I find that so illuminating.
What we haven't talked about, Joanna, is personal experience and
Yes.
kind of the layering of maturity you need to have to kind of approach some books.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah,
So personal experience is big. Um,
yeah,
and we also haven't talked about specialized knowledge. Like some books require some specialized knowledge that can
yeah,
also be adjacent to experience as well.
yeah,
But yes, what for me, I would say I think the first example that comes to my mind when I think of personal experience affecting my experience is Malazan, honestly, because and I talked about this when I met well, it wasn't when I met Steven Erikson 'cause I did meet Steven Erikson in person, which is cool, but I met him
yeah.
I also was in a stream with him one time, and I told him about this, but I I went through a really deep, difficult time in my life. I think, like, a year or 2 before I started the series, and, at that time in my life, I felt like I had to spend I spent a lot of time, like, digging into myself, like, really going deep, meditating a lot,
Hmm.
doing just a lot of inner work, and it brought me into this deep space that was really important for me. I think it really transformed me as a person. I think it made me the person I am today.
Hmm.
It set me up pretty well for when I actually met my husband, and then
Hmm.
when I read the series, there were the themes and the emotional experience, and I don't think that gets brought up enough, is that Malazan, when we talk about difficulty, I think one way that Malazan could be perceived as difficult for some people is just how incredibly emotional it is. It really goes into some deep emotional territory. And for
Yeah,
me, it brought up a lot of feelings and it brought up this well of depth of experience that I had accessed thanks to going through a really difficult time in my life and doing a lot of inner work. I felt like I connected to it in this deep way because of that. Um, I remember kind of explaining this to Steven Erikson, and he said, "That's exactly what I was going for." So I was like, "Okay, well, you did it," because I felt like it was like a deep sense of depth, of silence, of deep rootedness in 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 who I was. It's really kind of abstract to explain this into words, but I did
yes,
feel like having some life experience, going through some difficult times in life, spending time really, like I said, digging in and doing some deep introspection helped me. So when I read Malazan, I connected to it. I got it. I don't think I would have gotten it in the same way had I started the series before going through that experience.
yeah. And the difficulty here is, right, we could talk about so many different scenes in Malazan that kind of encapsulate some of this, and different scenes that encapsulate different feelings, but then would be venturing very heavily into spoiler territory. But in my mind, there's like 6 or 7 moments that, for me personally as well, kind of flash by, that articulate and speak to both who I was at that time and kind of helping me nudge a little bit further in the right direction. So it sounds like that was the same for you, but maybe perhaps even more so. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. I think what's interesting about Malazan is that when I think about this difficult time I went through, it was a lot of grief. I went through a lot of
Mm,
grief. I went through a lot of I went through a time when I was challenged to face a lot of insecurity and face the fact that I really struggled when it came to self-compassion. I know the series talks about compassion and all that, but I really struggled with self-compassion and
hmm.
looking at really difficult parts of myself and looking at really difficult, uncomfortable feelings inside of myself that I
Yes.
wanted to avoid. And so I spent some time confronting those parts of the soul, confronting those parts. And when I read Malazan, it connected, it hooked. I was like, "I know what this is, like, I get it." And so for me, it was so interesting because I know people like Philip Chase, for example, talks a lot about Stephen Donaldson's essay on fantasy and how fantasy could be this way of making us connect to our own world. That the psychic distance that we have in fantasy allows us to process things from our own world and integrate
Hmm.
back into our own lives. I haven't found that that has been the case for me with most fantasy, but I did find that the case for me with Malazan. I did find that some of what he was exploring in that series made me connect to looking at those difficult aspects of myself and also
Yeah.
looking at some difficult aspects of our world that are uncomfortable to look at. And I think he did it in a very nuanced way,
Yeah.
um, in a way that's not didactic, like we were talking about that word recently.
Yeah.
He does it in a way where he's exploring it with you. He's exploring it with you as a reader as he's writing.
Yes. That's such a good way of putting it. That he's exploring. It's not didactic at all. Sometimes there is a message at the end, but it's always the sense of he is exploring all the options and all the avenues here before, if he does land on a result, landing on it. Yeah, and I
Mhm.
don't think, just roping back to this word difficulty or challenge or reward or kind of all these synonyms that kind of fit together but are also kind of distinct. I wonder if you could have had the same kind of cathartic, if that's the word to use, experience
Yes. Mhm.
with a more, I don't want to say shallow text, but with a text that doesn't bring as much to the page. You know, it kind of goes back that maybe the challenge and the difficulty is what is able to give you that kind of emotional next step forward on your life journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think Malazan's an interesting so I think we should just go full in. What makes
let's
Malazan
do it.
difficult and why do people consider it difficult?
Do you know, I think for me, and I've said this a couple of times, I said it in this discussion, that for me, I read Malazan not too young, but at quite a young age, and not just young as in, because 19, I was 19, and 19 is older for some people than it is for others. But I think for me, part of the difficulty was lacking a couple of key knowledge components, and I can kind of split that into two. I think the first one is literally Malazan plays with some real world concepts that I had not encountered in fiction before. And spoilers. There is some parts of Malazan that rely heavily on economic knowledge and
Yes.
how the financial world works. And
Yes.
I did not have a clue about any of the kind of the stuff that goes along with economics and how systems work and how they're propped up by financial structures, among other things. And so reading this book, which I'll just keep anonymous for now, though everyone who's read it will know what I'm talking about. I literally did not get that. I failed to understand what was going on there. Like, why can't they just print more money? Do you know what I mean? I'm like, I was that shallow. So I think that for younger readers especially, and people like me who are a bit late to growing up, shall we say, that can be an issue. And I think the other issue with some people who read Malazan at a slightly younger age or a more immature age, is the way to put it, is that sometimes they lack the emotional depth to understand the plight of the characters. Um,
Mm.
a lot of these characters are going through things that you need to sit and think about. And think they're going through things that are actually often very horrible to think about. And if someone is a bit more emotionally immature, they will not really understand the weight of what's going on. Maybe I'll use one example. so it's quite early on, but there's a character called Felicen.
Mm.
So maybe we spoiler tag here or something, but I think
Mhm.
Felicen is a very interesting barometer of maybe someone's emotional intelligence, because for a lot of people, the first time they read about Felicen's journey, they hate her, they despise her, and they see her as someone who is annoying on the page, and okay, she's nasty. Why isn't she being nice to the cool warrior dudes? And it takes someone who has maybe grown up a bit to realize what's actually happening on the page there. I think Erikson has said something similar himself, that he failed to understand why so many people had this kind of negative reaction towards Felicen. So I think those two things can make a little bit of a choppy ride, and often maybe go a wee bit unacknowledged. Because when people say, again, going back to the thing we said at the beginning, is that with Malazan, people just say that we're difficult. And people automatically assume that means too many people, too much scope, dense prose. All of which can be true at various points, but I think for me personally, the first time I read it, it was much more that I needed to accumulate some real world experience before that text was accessible to me,
Yes. Yes.
and that's my
And
that's my mini essay.
I love that. I love that. I
Hmm.
can say that, um, not saying that I am the most literate person by any means. I feel like literacy skills are something that one can always continue to develop for the rest of their lives.
Hmm.
And, I'm certainly continuing on that journey with building my literacy skills, but I can say that when I started Gardens in the Moon, I don't think my literacy skills were very high. Now, this is slightly unrelated to maturity and experience, which we were just talking about, but I just
Hmm.
wanna add this because I know when I started Gardens in the Moon, I didn't really I guess I just didn't really think very deeply about needing to understand the book and what Erikson was going for, and I didn't so I just was in the moment, and I loved the way he wrote. I had never experienced a fantasy book
Yeah.
with that kind of tone, with that kind of richness of atmosphere, and that
Yes.
kind of mystery to the magic. I was coming
Yeah.
off reading a lot of Sanderson, and so this was just a very different experience of fantasy for me. And
Yeah.
so there was something very novel about the experience of reading Malazan for the first time for me. But I didn't I think I could easily enjoy it just on the level of this is new and different and interesting. And, the further I read in Malazan, I think it did teach me to become a better reader though, because of what
Hmm.
you're talking about. It did
Yeah.
get me um, to engage with the book, to engage with, okay, why is this character this way? Where is
Hmm.
this character coming from? What
Hmm.
might be driving their decisions? What might be the underlying emotion going on in this conversation, or what are the things that are unsaid here?
Hmm.
And, to trying to draw and extrapolate different meaning. And in addition to that, when you go further into the series, something that you could start to do is you could start to recognize how different storylines from different books, how they either they could be almost in conversation with each other. They can
Yeah.
almost be either have the same idea but presented in a different way. So you could start to
Hmm.
look at the themes in a little bit more of an analytical way, and you could start to synthesize ideas in your head, if that makes sense. Like you can kind of
Yeah.
move your way up the what is it? The Myers Briggs? Is that right? Not Myers Briggs. What is it? Uh, Bloom's taxonomy. You could start to move your way
Yes.
up
Yes.
Bloom's
Yes. Yes. Yes.
taxonomy. I cannot think of that right word. Yes. So I think it's interesting, just like so yes, you can get a rich experience out of looking at Malazan in depth with more advanced reading methods, but at the same time, you could also just be carried away by the emotions of what's happening. You could also just be entertained by the quirkiness of the Malazan Marines or
Yeah.
the fascinating battle scenes that are presented. I
Yes.
think that there are so many different levels of enjoyment with Malazan, but I do think a lot of people find it confusing because they might be just coming off a experience of fantasy that is explaining everything, that is telling you giving you a lot of exposition maybe? I don't
Yes.
know.
I think the other thing as well is, I mean, Erikson, famously wrote that can I call it a grumpy essay? I think you'll forgive me if I call it a grumpy
Yeah,
essay.
yeah, yeah. I know what you're talking
On
about.
character, and he literally, I think he
Yes,
actually said at the start, this might seem very grumpy, and to me when I read it, it did seem quite grumpy, although I knew
it
where he was
did.
coming from. But
Yeah.
he wrote that essay called, I think the accusation was Erikson can't write character, and
Mhm.
I I go back and forth because I think he can write character absolutely, but I don't think the criticism is necessarily that he can't write character. I think people often look at the characters on the page, and because each character has such thin page time, people will automatically approximate that to there's lots of characters, but none of them are very fleshed out and real. So I think when people read something like Gardens of the Moon, I'm rereading Gardens of the Moon right now, and in the first 100 pages, there's about 100 named characters. Not all of them are important, and some of them aren't important at all. But I think you get met with so many people on the stage that I think the reader is automatically inclined to think of that as, and none of them are actually that important, or none of them are actually that substantial. They're flimsy. And I think that also can throw people off at the beginning, even if you come to read the series properly and you realize no, these characters do have a lot of depth to them, that the page count does not actually equal complexity of character. Like you can meet someone and have a conversation with them for 5 minutes and find them an incredibly rich person, and then there's someone maybe you've known for 10 years and you're like, okay, I think you're fine. um, but I think there is an issue there where we kind of have to overcome some mental hurdles from pre-existing literature as well in terms of character, because we have to realize that the time we spend with them is not equal to the richness there. I think that's something that people kind of get thrown off on at first.
Ah, I love that. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, I completely agree with you about that.
yeah,
And I get comments to this day. I think I even just recently got a comment on my Malazan video from, like, a few years ago, and somebody said something along the lines of, like, "I just couldn't connect to this book. I DNF'd. The characters were just way too flat."
yes. Flat
But
is the
it
word that comes up a lot, isn't it?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes. But I think it's exactly what you're saying, and I think that that's actually kind of the beauty of the series is just understanding how easy it is to, pass people in the streets and feel like they don't really matter because
yes,
I don't know them, you know?
yes,
And I love that Malazan almost kinda gets you to grapple with the Good Samaritan effect of, like, can you actually look at this person and realize that they're just as worthy a human being as the people that you're close to in your family, that they
yeah.
matter too, that maybe and I think that that's the beauty of that, and I do think that Erikson is very good at character work
I
personally,
agree.
uh,
Yeah.
and I actually think some of his characters I grew more attached to in the second half of the series, to be honest,
You
but
know,
it could be just
the,
getting used to it, I don't know.
the second half of Malazan is really interesting because we're talking about prologues kind of throwing you off and prologues being really difficult. And I would never tell someone this who hasn't read Malazan, so forgive me if this is you haven't read Malazan yet. But I actually, when people talk about Malazan being difficult, I think the second half of Malazan is far more difficult than the first half.
Mm,
And you don't want to
yeah.
tell this to people because then they'll be like, oh, but I've just got through book three and I finally feel like I know what's going on. But I kind of think books 7 through 10 are the hardest ones to get through in terms of kind of that comprehension and understanding and appreciation. I don't know if you agree or disagree with me there.
I 100% agree with you, that's why
Yeah.
I'm always Uh, biting my tongue whenever people are only, like, a couple books into the series and saying, "This is my favorite series of all time." I'm like, "Well, you might wanna wait till you finish the series," because I know a lot of people in fact, I hosted a spoiler-free discussion after I finished
Mm,
the series with the one with, books with Brittany, Alan from the Library of Alexandria, Jimmy from the Fantasy Network, and Philip Chase, and it was interesting because I know Alan and Brittany, they teamed up and they were like, "Yeah, I didn't really like the last few books as much." Like,
Alan doesn't like Toll the Hounds, does he? Is that right?
no, he does not like Toll the Hounds.
My
No,
favorite
no,
book of all time.
I'm misspeaking, I'm sorry. Alan does like Toll the Hounds, but he doesn't like it as much. It's like his least favorite,
Yeah.
but he
For me,
still
it's at the
likes it.
top. Yeah.
For me, it's one of my least favorite, and that's
Why?
a
Tell me
whole
why.
Oh, you wanna know? Okay.
Yeah, just so I know we have to keep this spoiler free, but I am curious because
Sure.
I love difference of opinion, but for me, it's the best, and
Yeah.
I always love hearing the other perspectives.
For me, I felt when I read Toll the Hounds okay, there are a few different things I need to say about Toll the Hounds.
Mm,
One, I never enjoyed talking about a book more than I enjoyed talking about Toll the Hounds after I read it. Like the
yeah.
discussion that I was part of a discussion group on Jimmy's channel, and we had such an incredible rich discussion about it. I also had a wonderful discussion on my channel about it. I loved talking about Toll the Hounds, and after I
Mhm,
finished it, I went back and I reread certain passages over and over and over again, and there were certain parts of it that I could extract that were just so interesting and so
yeah.
layered. At the same time, when I read the book, I have to admit that there was part of me and I know I'm alone in this, and I'm not speaking for anybody else, I'm just speaking for myself, just to
Yeah.
clarify. But when I read the book, there was part of me that it just felt like I was outside the experience of the book. I felt like
Okay.
this book is not written for me. I felt and then part of this could be altered by the conversations I was seeing, like, hearing a Critical Dragon talk about it, hearing Philip Chase talk about it, hearing my friend Andy Smith talk about it at the time.
Hmm.
But I felt like this to me feels like when I was reading it, I kept feeling I know this is gonna sound strange, especially coming from me, if you notice all the kinds of books I read, but I
Yeah,
felt like it felt very masculine to me. And to me, it
interesting.
felt like, as a female reader, I felt outside of that experience. I felt like this is grief or retirement or coming to a crossroads in life from a male perspective,
Yes.
and not in a bad way. I thought it was well done, but I just felt like it wasn't really for me, like, it wasn't I wasn't the int I just somehow felt like I wasn't the intended audience for that book.
Do you know, I'm trying to think of, now that you're just saying this. First of all, I realize I sounded very accusatory, like explain yourself. Um,
No,
but
it's fine.
I'm trying to now think about the major women characters in Toll the Hounds compared to other ones. And that there are, am I right in saying there are actually, and I know that female characters does not equal written for women, but just my initial reaction there was I can't think of that many compared to
There
previous.
aren't. There aren't
No,
very
there
many.
aren't, are there?
Mm-mm.
There's it's
Um,
interesting because when you maybe we can cut this out. I'll
yeah.
try and speak very vaguely.
No.
The
Yeah.
climax of that book is celebrated, but it's lots of you're right. It's lots of um, big, powerful dudes meeting each other, isn't it?
Yeah, and even the dogs, the
You're
hounds
right.
themselves felt kind of aggressive and masculine, and that's gonna be sound weird for me because like, Karsa is one of my favorite characters, like, I enjoy anytime Karsa's on the page, but
Yeah.
something about it and it's interesting because when you were talking to Erikson, he talked about how motherhood was a huge part of that book, but I just still felt outside of it. But yeah, I just didn't quite connect to that one in the same way, and at the same time, I did get a lot out of it. I love the way that he talks about I'm probably gonna cut this part out,
That's
but
fine.
I love the way he talked about, redemption and fanaticism and, what is it? Absolution versus redemption, like the
Yes.
conversation about that, like, really
Yes.
interesting philosophical religious discussion in that
Hmm.
book.
Do you know?
That
And I guess we can maybe revert to just getting off the spoilers, so for the sake of the video. But
yeah.
Fall of Light, I had a similar reaction to. For some people, it's a lot of their absolute beloved crowning gem of everything that Erickson has written, and for me, um, I found. I mean, it's not that it's different reason from yourself, you know, because it's not whether it was written for me or not. But I found with Fall of Light, and this is heresy among some people, that the philosophizing just started to take over the plot in a way that maybe I found slightly too much.
Oh,
And I know
wow.
that and just going back to Malazan, the last half being more difficult than the first half. I think I often compare it to chocolate. Is how I describe it to people. I say, you know, Gardens of the Moon is like a milk chocolate bar. Toll the Hounds is like a dark chocolate bar, and Fall of Light is like one of those 99.9% cacao, like $10 bars that you see at the top of the shelf. That is kind of the deluxe, but also very very much for a certain subsection of people. And that's kind of how I felt with Fall of Light. I kind of taken a bite of it and going, this is maybe a bit too rich for me in terms of how the denseness is a negative word. I don't mean it to sound negative, but for my personal preference, it was perhaps one step too far.
That is such a brilliant way of describing it. I love
Yeah,
this
yeah,
chocolate analogy.
yeah,
Perfect.
yeah.
Perfect.
And
Yeah.
you could apply it to so many books. It's a great analogy. If I do say so myself.
Yeah.
Baker is like 70% cacao, I would say. He's kind of on the edge for me. But I would say that Baker so far for me, and I'm only one book and a bit in, I would say he is about at the same level that the back half of Malazan is in terms of challenge difficulty.
Yeah. So do you find it very philosophical so far? Is that what it
Yes, but
is?
I've read so little of Baker, so I always hesitate to bring him up because I feel like such a novice. Um, I think because I was more primed for what Baker was, because I bounced off that prologue so many times. So when I finally sat down again on a plane, I don't know if I told you this. There's a running theme going on to read The Darkness That Comes Before, and that was just this year. I was flying back to Kuwait for just for after New Year's. And I finally decided to read this book. I knew what it was, and actually from the prologue that was the hardest bit, and it's become a little bit smoother since. So for me, it wasn't much of an issue, but for me, it was more about the expectations that I brought coming in. And this is something that I love that you do on occasion is to actually say, listen, these are my expectations going in, and here's the reality, and here's how my feeling about this book might have been tempered by my expectation. And that's another
Yeah.
level to challenge, isn't it? Is what we bring to the table.
Yeah, I had to do that for my last wrap up, but I had not done
Yeah.
that before, but I just
Yeah.
wanted to because I had so much buildup going into those books.
Yes.
And so I guess that leads me to another question, which is that do you get excited if you hear that there's a fantasy or sci-fi book that's challenging? Let's use the word challenging rather than just difficult. Do
Yeah.
you think that that's something that entices you? Like, for example, hearing about Wolf lately, since you haven't read Book of the New Sun. Is that something for you that entices you? Like, "Oh, I get to grapple with something and, challenge my mind a bit." Or is that something that maybe, mm, makes you wanna bounce off and look towards a different direction?
So the answer is I've got a very clear answer to this because I've got evidence to support this assertion. Is that broadly, when I hear about something like Gene Wolfe, I'm like, yes, I can't wait to read that. But the reality is, like, I'm going to go off screen for just a minute. I buy all these books. Hang on, here's four that all have reputations for being dense, and they languish on my bookshelf. So I've got Anathema here, which I bought 3 years ago and I've been carrying around and haven't cracked open. I've
Mm.
heard it's very dense and complex. I've heard it's very rewarding. It's still here. I've got. I'll do this one last. Actually, I've got Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar, which is an experimental novel. I don't know if you've heard, but apparently
Uh-uh.
it's almost like a choose your own adventure for adults, but
Huh.
written in like a literary style. Um, yeah. So it sounds amazing. Haven't read it. The granddaddy of difficult books, Infinite Jest. I
Yeah.
have carried this brick with me around the world, from Japan to Scotland to Kuwait, and I've not opened it. So I think there's a thing as well, and maybe this is something as well that we could talk about, is that there is a almost like a medal or like trophy vibe that often comes with these big books. Here you can use that for the thumbnail. There you go. Where we like to read them, but often it's not just for a sense of reward; it's so that we can say we've read them. And that can also be an issue with reading. That if I were to read Infinite Jest and I were to even just moderately like it, I can guarantee you that when I put it on my bookshelf, I'm not going to put it in the obscure corner. I'm going to put it pride of place up the top, so everyone knows that I've read Infinite Jest. Um,
Interesting.
so I think there is. I'm just looking at man. I don't think I'm going to get to this anytime soon. Um, there's um there's an issue that I have where I'm attracted to the idea. I think of difficulty sometimes, but finding time, and that's a whole other issue with difficulty, isn't it? Finding time to follow through. Like if I had a week to myself, Anathema would be one of the first things that I would be adding to the high ranks of the TBR. But life gets in the way, doesn't it? Sometimes it's easier to pick up Stephen King, who I love to pieces, or Brandon Sanderson, who I
Oh.
enjoy. It's easier to gravitate towards those when time is so limited and we're also cognitively fried.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I have another question for you. When
Yeah.
you approach said difficult book, like if you ever pick up in Infinite Jest, for example,
Yeah.
um, what is your approach to that? Now, this is similar to a question I think you and Jake talked about on his channel,
Hmm.
Nerd Level Rising Jake. Like, do you take notes? Do you write in the margins? Do you use tabs? Do you have any annotation that you do? Because I have my own answer to this, but I want to hear your answer to this
My
question
answer,
again.
my answer is no, but it's more because I'm lazy than anything else. I love the idea of sort of sitting at a desk and opening up the book and having my pen and my highlighter and all the stuff. But it just doesn't happen. And I think that's, again, it just comes back to maybe a time thing where I'm just frazzled and I grab the book and I just jump onto the sofa. What I do tend to do is, if the book is challenging, and interesting hearing you talk earlier about following along with a podcast or something, because when I first read Malazan, I did the Tor reread. Tor had like a series of
Ah,
blog posts.
yes.
I
Mhm.
followed that. When I read War and Peace, I had I think it was Spark Notes or Schmoop or one of those just side by side, and I feel no shame in doing that. And then Ulysses was a similar thing. I had basically on my phone a running commentary on that whole book side by side. But in terms of actual annotation and pen on paper, I want to, but I haven't so far really done that for anything. What was
Ah.
your answer going to be?
Oh, I almost feel like I should make a whole separate video about this, but
Yeah.
I used to be a big annotator. And actually, I should bring this back into the Malazan part because when I was reading Malazan, I did take a copious amount of notes that I typed on
Mm.
my computer. But I also tabbed the heck out of my books, and I had a whole color coded system. And this is an interesting as it relates to difficulty because I decided when I was reading Malazan, I would use orange tabs if there was something I didn't understand or found confusing so that I could
Yes.
go back to the orange tabs. I found oddly, I hardly ever used those orange tabs, which is strange. So I
Mm.
don't know why. I don't know why I didn't find because it has such a reputation for being confusing and difficult,
Yes.
but I didn't find I had to do that very much, and I think part of it is that but what I did notice when I did that, the tabbing, which was kinda cool, is that sometimes I would tab a certain theme, like I had certain, colors for themes or character things or whatever. Sometimes I would read the book or finish the book, and I go back and I remember even I did this with Gardens of the Moon, and I'd go back to certain tabs, and I'd find, "Oh, I have a whole other context for what that
Yes.
earlier tab was about." So I think that's
Yes.
why Malazan can seem a little challenging, is that he presents things, and it's not that it's confusing what he presents, but it's more that you just don't quite have the context yet. It's like, "Okay, I get that there's a thing, I don't" and you keep reading, later on you look back, you're like, "Oh, that is part of this," and it's like almost like this whole language kinda comes over you. Do you find that's the case? Because I found that was the case even when I
Yeah.
reread the prologue of Gardens of the Moon after finishing book 10. I'm like, "Oh, wow. I feel like I understand this." It's almost like putting this on with a new pair of like putting on a
Yes.
new pair of glasses or something.
I
But
I I love. Sorry, did I cut you off there?
go ahead. No, I'll
No,
get to my point. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I love going back to the first 10% of a book, even a book that I don't enjoy very much. Sun Eater, Empire of Silence. I went back and read the first 10%. Blood over Brighthaven. I know we disagree on Blood over Brighthaven, but I went back to that first 10% and was shocked by how, because you knew there was going to be, again speaking very vaguely here, there was going to be references to later on in the book thematically and whatever. But I was surprised by how many there were in the first 20, 30
Oh,
pages. I often think it's a good metric of how accomplished and what's the word um, thought through a text is by how
yeah.
much is there in the beginning. So I'm totally with you. What I kind of would want from more books, to be honest, is like how you have like Bibles and things like that that are called like annotated Bibles where they have big thick margins on the sides. I kind of want more of that for just regular fiction, where so many people do love to annotate. So why not just provide the space? Because often
Yeah,
with these
well
kind of mass market, like how are you going to annotate like something like that? It's just impossible.
no. Well,
Yeah.
see, I don't do it anymore, and here's why.
Mm,
I started and I have, like, a video that it kind of explains this that I did a year ago. What I started doing sometimes I do use some tabs here and there, or if I have an ebook, I might highlight a line here or there, but I don't
yeah.
really use it the way that I used to. What I do instead nowadays, and this does take I know this isn't gonna appeal to everyone. I totally understand if this doesn't appeal to you, David, but I keep a reading journal now. And what I do with my reading journal is I write 1 page a day in my reading journal, and
Oh, nice.
I use marginalia in my reading journal. So what I do is I have a lined reading journal. Here's maybe an example to show you.
I'd love to see if it's
Well, this is
possible.
a mess, but this is kind of like an example. This is from Too Like the Lightning, which is another confusing book in some ways,
Uh-huh.
or it takes a lot of concentration to understand
So it's
or
one it's
to
one A4 page per day.
Well, it's actually a smaller my journal that I've been using is a lot smaller than this, but it's
Yeah,
1 page per day. I draw a line for a margin, and what I do is I write just and I might use my highlights or my tabs as a reference for that day of reading, and
yes,
I will write just, like, the pertinent thoughts that come into my head of what I read, and they might
yes,
have to do with what happened or what I understood or how I felt about it. Then in the margin, I go back and read over my 1 page and I write out, if it's like a theme or, I might write something like, let's see if I this is such a bad example here. Um, so I might write like government or I might write, like a specific kind of theme like, memory or I might write plot device or I might write, uh, intrigue or, I might write a key word that comes to
yes,
mind based on what I wrote. And I love this method because 1, it just takes a few minutes a day. I'm
yeah,
not stopping to write out a note or to write in the
yes,
margin, and it's such a great reference because now, like, it's helped me it helped me immensely with the Baker discussions with Philip because
hmm,
often I finish those books and we would maybe schedule those, discussions, like, a month later, and
yeah,
it's hard to keep all that stuff in your head, but if I
yeah,
looked back in my journal, it would be a lot of work to read through all my journal entries, but I wouldn't have to do that necessarily. I could look in the margins at those keywords, and it would bring
yeah,
back the memory right away, whereas, the problem I have with tabs is, like this blood meridian, I have so many notes, so many words in the margins, and so many tabs, and I have no idea what I'm talking about when I pick this up.
Yes, yes,
This is
yeah. So
so
I have that on my notes
useless
app on
for
my
me.
phone. Yeah. What did I mean by plot stirs greatly? Like, what does that mean? Like, and it was like
It's
me yesterday. Yeah,
meaningless. It's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
meaningless.
I
But
had
if I
that for
need
my master's dissertation as well. I'm like, what did I mean by that bullet point? It's gone. Do you know what I mean? I just wasted my own time. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So that's
I
like
think.
my approach. I love it because
Yeah,
I otherwise like and the act of writing, like handwriting, and putting it into your own words too,
yeah.
like what you understood, I think that that actually helps your understanding of a text in a different way too.
Do you know what I think I've fallen victim to just hearing you speak? Is I think I've fallen victim to the TikTokification of annotation, and I don't mean to sound negative, but but I feel like often when I see annotation and like YouTube channels that do annotation or TikToks that do annotation, and there's nothing wrong with this, so please don't misunderstand me, but it's often more for kind of aesthetic purposes than actually delving into the book. Would that be fair? Like it's people kind of enjoying the process. It's almost like a fun process to kind of I'm trying to think of the right words because I don't want to come across as too negative or smug with it, but kind of your journey with the book and you kind of make it yours. You customize it by adding all these labels and things like that. But I'm much more gravitate towards what you're articulating there, which is kind of taking the parts of the book that actually resonate with you or have thematic complexity and storing them and keeping them safe. I think that's a much more me way of doing it. I hope I
Yeah.
don't sound negative about the other ways. It's not that, but um, I think sometimes annotation can be kind of aesthetic over trying to get something more out of the text itself. Would that be a
Yes.
fair way of putting it?
Yes, yes, yes. And
Yeah, yeah,
I feel so strongly about it because and this relates to our difficulty discussion too, because I think I'm a reader who's okay with not understanding everything I'm reading. Like, I
yes.
think I'm okay with a certain amount of confusion in my stories or being in the dark about how everything works or what's going on. I feel like I have a higher tolerance for it maybe than some readers. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. But I know that like what I try to do is even if I do feel like I'm in the dark and I'm not totally grounded in the story, then I will just try to engage with what I can understand or what
Hmm.
I am drawn to in the story, and that's how I engage. So even if not everything's clear, at least I've engaged with something. And so it makes me
Yes.
feel like I'm getting something out of the story, even if it's not all 100% clear, like the
I
Wolf
think I
experience,
think
for example.
I think booktube and just in general and in the classroom as well. I think we all big collective we here need to get better at saying when we don't understand something as well. Like that's okay. And maybe
Mm.
this goes back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation because I often think that people often feel embarrassed if they didn't get a certain plot point. Like it makes them bad readers, or that makes them a little bit less intelligent, or So often you go, did you? Yeah, 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 and that comes back to the students going, yeah, yeah, I did understand that because. It's uncomfortable to say maybe I didn't like that when in reality maybe the author's done a poor job of explaining it first of all, or maybe it's an aesthetic response and they want you to be. It sounds like Gene Wolfe. They kind of want you to kind of be a bit unsure at times, and that's deliberate. And often it's a collective experience. Do you know what I mean? There's one part in the back half of Gardens of the Moon where I'm still, and I've read it 3 times, not Gardens of the Moon, later on in Malazan, where I'm still like, I'm not fully sure I understand what's happening there. And then the buddy read I'm doing with Shay and Preacher, I'm getting a bit worried because I'm worried we're going to get to that book and they're going to go, can you just explain this to me? And I'm going to have to go, nah, because there are still elements of that text that I'm uncertain about, or maybe have gotten lost. It's something that I'm also quite passionate about. That it's okay to misunderstand things. Sometimes that's the author's fault. Sometimes it's the author's purpose, and sometimes it's just the way things are. I don't know if
Oh,
that. Yeah, it sounds like
yes.
we're in agreement there.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, I love this. Yes,
yeah,
yes, absolutely. You're so right on about that. I think that's actually a perfect point to come to a close with the discussion about.
no worries.
Yeah, do you feel good about that?
That's fine by me. Yeah,
All right. Well, thank you so much, David, for joining me with this discussion today. I always just learned so much from you. I love your insights about books, and
thank
you
you.
just brought so much to this topic that it was wonderful just to flesh out some ideas on what makes a book difficult, talking about some examples, and that's such a good takeaway that you gave us at
Yeah.
the end too.
Well, listen, thank you for having me on. Thank you for bearing with me because it has been a bit turbulent behind the scenes in terms of like actually being able to have a stable image of myself on the call. But yeah, it's been wonderful chatting to you. Both on and off. And yeah,
Yeah.
I do count you as a friend, and it's
Oh,
been nice to kind of have a proper face to face conversation as well.
oh, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm so happy to be able to connect with you and have this
um,
conversation. I hope we'll have many, many more in the future.
I
And
love that.
and if you all aren't subscribed to David's channel, Four Corners of the Page, please subscribe. He definitely deserves all the praise, all the recognition. Just one of my favorite channels that I've discovered this year. Just wonderful person too. So thank you all so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.